Gun group political spending data shows the races to watch on election night, plus a federal appeals court upholds Washington, D.C.'s magazine ban. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. TheReload.com, of course, is where you can head on over today and sign up for our free weekly newsletter. It'll keep you up to date on all things happening in the world of gun politics and policy. This week's episode is also brought to you in part by The Dispatch, but more on that at the end of the show. To kick us off this week, we wanted to dive into a little bit of the gun group spending numbers. We're obviously about a week away from Election Day, so a lot of this stuff is fairly baked in at this point, and the numbers that we have available at the moment give us a pretty good idea of at least where the major gun players are focusing their attention for this upcoming election. So some of the big indicators were obviously the top of the ticket garnered a lot of attention from gun groups on both sides. As far as outside spending goes, the NRA has spent about $4.2 million in the presidential race. Groups like Everytown have spent about $3 million at the top of the ticket. But they sort of diverge as we get further down ballot, where the NRA is devoting its big money, independent expenditures to Senate races, where Everytown seems to be directing a lot of their stuff towards closely divided swing district House races.
Yeah, certainly there's some overlap there, right, with the NRA also
Sure.
going after some House races, primarily the Rep. Golden in Maine. That race they've been heavily involved in, and we talked about that one last week, and actually we're going to talk about it a little bit later in some of the headline section. But certainly there does seem to be a split in where they're allocating resources, right? Because the NRA is a bit more focused on those Senate seats that will probably determine control of the Senate, whereas Everytown is more focused on the House, and Giffords as well. Right? Giffords is also a major player in this whole fight. But and it also, I think, speaks to something we talked about before too, with the spreading out of the money. We talked a bit about this with Ed Morrissey last week on the interview podcast, where the gun control groups have a money advantage this cycle, for the first time in a presidential cycle, really. And they're using it to really spread out their impact to a lot of races beyond the top of the ticket. And that, I think, is the biggest distinction. Whereas the NRA is trying to, it seems from these numbers, laser focus on a few key races, right? They want to flip the Montana Senate, put the seat over to the Republican side. They're backing Sheehy. I think they've spent $2,085,499, right, according to Open Secret's tracking of the Federal Elections Commission reports. So, and then they're going into Ohio as well, right? Bernie Moreno, 1.5 million, and backing him and opposing Sherrod Brown, the incumbent Democrat. And then, another 1.2 million to boost McCormick in Pennsylvania over incumbent Bob Casey. So those are the races that are most likely to flip to the Republican side in this election in the Senate and help Republicans regain control there. And that is, I think, what a lot of the political watchers think is most likely to happen. You see a Republican Senate, regardless of what happens with the presidency and the House at this point. And then, the House is a much closer affair, where there's a number of swing seats that are going to be what determines how things go there. And that'll probably be impacted as well by who wins the presidency. That tends to happen, where you'll see the victorious presidential candidate ends up with a House majority in a lot of cases, especially where, like this year, the House is already very closely divided, and Democrats only need a couple pickups to take it, and Republicans only, they only need to hold what they have to keep it. So And the Senate's a little different than the House, right, in that regard, because the Senate, only a third of seats are up every 2 years. So a lot of what happens in the Senate is determined by that map, and the map is not favorable to Democrats this year.
No, yeah, it's funny. So obviously Ohio and Montana are the two races the NRA has spent the most in as far as down ballot races. And neither of those, the gun control groups haven't put any money, at least in terms of independent expenditures, towards those races. So that tells you, I think, where the confidence is. On the flip side, the single biggest expenditure that Everytown has made, they've spent over $1 million attacking Republican Congressman Mark Molinaro, who's in New York. And so that tells you in 2022, if listeners will recall, Republicans in the House at least performed pretty well, particularly in swing districts in California and New York. That's sort of what gave them their majority in 2022. And that's really where the gun control groups are putting their resources, is trying to claw back those gains that Republicans made in those overall blue states, but in these more purple districts in those blue states where they think they're pressing issues. We've reported they're pressing issues like abortion, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, and trying to go after these incumbent Republicans.
Yeah, same thing with Giffords, right? 1.1 million trying to unseat Mike Garcia in California's 27th district. That's a similar idea there. These Republicans who are in what are now swingier California and New York districts. That's where the gun control groups are spending the bulk of their money. But these are all interesting races to watch for on election day. If you're wondering what the read is going to be on gun politics and how it had an impact, because while it hasn't, while there's a stark contrast at the top of the ticket, especially on gun policy, it hasn't been a top issue in the race, right? That's not as true for some of these lower level races, especially like the Golden race, where that's kind of been the top issue, the main issue. Is his change in position on assault weapons ban. So there are these races to look at if you really want to determine how the political world is going to read gun politics coming out of the 2024 election.
Yeah, one thing I think is interesting, particularly about that Golden race. So that's the NRA's biggest House investment so far. They spent about $107,000, which their House strategy has been just spread money around to all the races in smaller dollar amounts. But that was their biggest outside spending in a House race. And neither of the gun control groups have registered any outside spending to help. Jared Golden's sort of not been their typical Democratic candidate that they would have supported in past elections. But it's interesting to see that they're choosing not to help support him after he took a stand in a district where he's vulnerable for doing so, to support a gun ban. And they don't seem to be providing any outside help to help keep him in the House. So I think that's interesting.
It is interesting. Yeah, for sure. Because I think they've spent not a ton, but they've spent some in the Fitzpatrick race, the Republican in Pennsylvania, who has backed gun control measures in the past, including the assault weapons ban in 2021, right? Wasn't it? Or 2022.
Yeah.
The last time the House passed one, before the midterms, like right before the midterms. So I guess it would have been 2022, just later in 2022, or earlier before the election in 2022. Anyway, they've spent money trying to help him out, because he's also in a swingier district. But yeah, they're not backing Golden, who has traditionally been opposed to. I mean, Golden is in this weird spot as far as policy goes, because he supports an assault weapons ban now after, as we talked about before, after the Lewiston shooting, because he represents Lewiston. But he doesn't support things like universal background checks or red flag laws. I don't believe. So he's kind of in a strange policy position, and he's tried to push back against the attacks on his record on guns as well, as you noted in your members piece on that race. So I don't know. I guess they don't see him as a really strong ally worth saving or worth spending money to try and keep in office. But it is a strange strategic decision in the end there, because it's going to be a close race, and I would assume that they'd rather have him than the Republican who would likely replace him.
Yeah, you'd certainly think so. But it also could be one of these things where maybe evidence of their outside help would actually hurt him even more in that district, because maybe his opponents could say, look, he's being funded by the gun control groups. This is who he is. So that could be, maybe some of what's going on there. And then the other big, I think, just overall takeaway from this stuff is the NRA. This is a constant theme that we've talked about through all our reporting this cycle. Is just the NRA's financial position vis-a-vis these gun control groups. On an individual basis, the NRA is the biggest outside spender. So it still has that. But if you combine the gun control group's resources, they're way outspending the NRA, which has never been the case before in a presidential cycle.
Right. Yeah. And additionally, as you profiled here, there are other gun rights groups involved, and the industry as well. For instance, the National Shooting Sports Foundation, the industry's trade group, has 2 different PACs that they're using this election, but they don't make up the gap, and they're not even really close to making up the gap, right? So it's a very bad trajectory for the gun rights movement overall. And as we talked about this with Ed as well last week, it's sort of a combination of things. One is the decline of the NRA. And especially the loss of membership after their corruption scandal, which limits how much they can raise, because it limits the number of people they can raise from with their PAC, because they have to raise from NRA members. But now there are other ways of getting money into these things, obviously. But regardless, so you've had that decline, and then at the same time, you've seen the gun control groups boost their spending and follow through on some of these big dollar promises that they made and that they've made in previous cycles, but not followed through on. So it's sort of a dual attack, it's something where it's not just the decline of the NRA leading to this. It's also the increase of these gun control groups at the same time.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And listeners, there's plenty of other spending details in there. And I break down all the other groups too, what they're contributing. They're just obviously, as we just mentioned, not as big of a player as the NRA or the big gun control groups. But listeners should check out that piece and get a feel for where these gun groups are at going into next week's election. But moving on to our next big story of the week, we had a pretty significant ruling out of the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, where that court upheld the district's ban on what it called extra large capacity magazines. We got a new term. You've heard large capacity magazines. Well, here's extra large capacity magazines. And what they mean by that is anything that can hold more than 10 rounds, which is, typical for these kinds of bans. But they upheld that ban despite finding that magazines were in common use, which is somewhat new.
Yeah, well, they found not just that they were in common use, but that they're arms protected by the Second Amendment, right? They're arms under the right to keep and bear arms, and they are also in common use, and not just in common use for lawful purposes, but also in common use for self-defense. That's what this court, the majority, held, which is pretty surprising, because they also obviously upheld the ban on them. And usually many of the other courts that have upheld these hardware bans will either say they aren't arms to begin with, they're not protected arms, they don't fall under the definition of an arm, or that they're not in common use specifically for self-defense. That's been one of those things that courts have argued over, whether common use is just for lawful purposes or common use is specifically for self-defense. And you will often see federal judges who uphold these types of restrictions arguing that magazines that hold more than 10 rounds, or whatever the limit tends, because the limit changes state to state, what a large capacity, or I guess extra large capacity magazine is similar to assault weapon. It's a floating term. It's varies from state to state, and it can even vary within the state depending on what kind of firearm the magazine is for, right? Some states have different limits for handguns and long guns. But, oftentimes states will also have different limits from other states, 15 rounds or 10 rounds or what have you. So, but regardless, they'll generally, when upholding these sorts of laws, you will often hear the claim that they aren't in common use for self-defense, because the argument will be that they that self-defense shootings rarely require more than 10 rounds or whatever the limit happens to be. Or at least that they don't have evidence of many self-defense shootings involving more than 10 rounds being fired by the defender, which is obviously a extremely hard metric to track. There's not really some sort of a perfect database of self-defense shootings that counts up all the rounds used in it. But, that is a common argument. So it's interesting to see this court both hold that, or at least assume that these extra large capacity magazines are both arms under the Second Amendment's definition and in common use for self-defense, and then go ahead and say that they can be banned anyway. And even the way they got to that is kind of interesting, right? Because they don't go the traditional path that you see other courts have done.
No, that's right. They actually rejected several of the analogs that you see some of these other courts accept as valid for these types of bans. Gunpowder storage restrictions at the time of the founding, for instance, this comes up in a lot of gun cases just because many of these are just, there weren't that many, quite frankly, weapons adjacent restrictions at the time of the founding. So they get brought up in case after case after case. Right. But many courts have accepted this.
Yeah, you hear the same ones over and over.
And this court said, no, that's not valid. Time, they call them time, place, and manner restrictions, at least in this case, as how they were described. Things like trap guns, where you set an unattended firearm that goes off, it's triggered by something, and it fires by a mechanical, a string or something. And the court called that silly for that to be invoked as one of these.
They called the gunpowder storage, the idea that that's an analog to the magazine restrictions, is they called it silly because the gunpowder storage restriction was a fire prevention measure. It wasn't designed to try and limit how much somebody could fire their firearms.
Right.
It was meant to prevent the gunpowder from catching on fire and burning down the town or whatever.
Right.
And same for these other ones. They just didn't see the how or why being similar at all.
Yeah. So they essentially wrote off.
And in fact, they actually. Yeah, well, in fact, they basically said they agreed that there was no actual historical regulation on either magazines or ammunition capacity generally, right?
Yeah, they said there's no perfect analog, but they pulled out the unprecedented, societal concern. The language from Bruin, where they were in the majority opinion, they talked about a more nuanced approach being warranted when there's unprecedented societal concerns brought about by new technology. So therefore, we can look, more loosely at history. And of course, Bowie knives came up as an 19th century Bowie knife bans and pocket pistol restrictions.
Well, here's the quote, right, from the majority, which was an unsigned opinion. Just a little odd because it's a 3-judge panel and there was one dissent. So only 2 people in the majority, but for whatever reason, neither one signed their name. But the quote is, because ELCMs implicate unprecedented societal concerns and dramatic technological changes, the lack of a precise match does not preclude finding at this preliminary juncture an historical tradition analogous enough to pass constitutional muster. Therefore, we hold Hansen, who is the plaintiff, is not sufficiently likely to succeed on the merits of his claim to warrant the entry of a preliminary injunction against enforcement of the magazine cap. Now, so I guess just to make a quick comment on the procedural stuff here, this was a request for a preliminary injunction, right, to block enforcement of the law at the beginning stages of this litigation. So technically, this is not a ruling on the merits. However, in practice, if a judge denies you a preliminary injunction, especially when they write out a long opinion reasoning why you haven't met the threshold of irreparable harm that justifies issuing a preliminary injunction, the ruling on the merits is probably going to be exactly the same thing. That's usually how these things go, almost to the point of as somebody who's not a lawyer or a judge, the whole thing seems a bit silly, right? This is the ruling that this court is going to handle. They're just almost certainly not going to change its mind when they come back around for the merits arguments, if they would even get to that. right, in a case like this. So this, for all intents and purposes, in my view at least, this is the ruling that the court is going to stick with. Anyway, that's what they argued, right? So the unprecedented societal concern, which is mass shootings, right? Mass shootings didn't exist at the founding. And this is the argument that this is the familiar part, right? That we've heard this stuff before. And therefore, and those mass shootings were brought on by the advent of, in this case, they're talking about like the combination of semi-automatic firearms with magazines that hold more than 10 rounds, which is a little bit, there's definitely a bit of a jump there because that technology was invented in like the 1890s, and they pinned the beginning of mass shootings in the 1940s, like 1949, I think is the first one that they cite. So they don't really get into why they think there was a big gap between the technological advancement and the unprecedented societal concern. But the point is, they're saying it doesn't matter that there weren't ammunition restrictions or magazine restrictions or something close to a magazine restriction at the founding era, because the founding didn't have mass shootings and the founding didn't have detachable magazines or semi-automatic firearms. That's what they're going with. And so then they go to the broader perspective, right? And what do they? Yes. They reject some of these other laws, but what do they fall on? What do they come down to?
Bowie knives and pocket pistols in the 19th century, and then all the way through Prohibition when the NFA was passed, obviously, and so the restrictions on machine guns and sawed-off shotguns. They say that creates a broad tradition of governments responding to new concerns by prohibiting these especially dangerous weapons or whatever. Unprecedented lethality, I think, is the phrase that they use to describe these arms. And so that's what they say is the historical tradition that justifies DC's modern day mag ban.
Right. And here's the quote that they use for this. Although these laws may target different crimes than does the magazine cap, they share the same basic purpose: to inhibit then unprecedentedly lethal criminal activity by restricting or banning weapons that are particularly susceptible to and were widely used for multiple homicides and mass injuries. Because many of the preceding examples are also outright bans on an entire class of weapons, they impose a burden on the right to armed self-defense comparable to, if not greater than, the burden imposed by the district's magazine cap. So that's their logic. Basically, they're claiming that Bowie knives, which are literally just knives. I mean, that's one of the weird things about the whole Bowie knife thing. Like, it gets used a lot because it was one of the only real weapons restrictions that existed in the country on a scale close to what Bruin would seem to require. Although a lot of times they weren't bans on the knives themselves. Some of them were, but most of them were bans on like carrying a knife, concealed basically. But, a Bowie knife is kind of just a big knife. You know what I mean? Like the idea that it's an unprecedentedly lethal weapon is a little odd, right? That just strikes me as a bit strange. It's a knife. It's a big knife. If that, knives were clearly around before Bowie knives. It's a knife that became associated with criminal activity and clearly, include that and dirks and pocket pistols or whatever, right? That you get this list of certain weapons. Essentially they're saying that magazines that hold more than 10 rounds are in this class of weapons that are so dangerous that they present an unprecedented problem for society, and therefore it's okay to ban them because that's what happened with these Bowie knives. They're also like, of course, the Bowie knife thing is the only thing that's really close to the era that Bruin talks about, that founding era, the pre-Civil War, post, ratification of the Second Amendment. The other stuff, like they talk about the NFA and restrictions on magazines specifically for machine guns fully automatic weapons that existed. Those were all obviously 20th century restrictions. So, they're kind of pointing to that as a tradition that continued through from Bowie knives to the NFA to today with these magazine caps. That's their reasoning for this. But I don't know. It's an interesting case to see them go that far in recognizing magazines that hold more than 10 rounds to be, presumptively protected by the Second Amendment, and then say that you can still ban them anyway because of this historical tradition. As the dissent notes from Judge Justin Walker, who's a Trump appointee, but he notes he argues that it would make more sense to just stop after you determine that these are arms in common use for self-defense, because in his view, and I think this is probably what the Supreme Court would hold as well if they ever took up a case like this, which is a separate question. As we've talked about, they've sidestepped a lot of these Second Amendment cases in recent months. But, the idea that that an arm protected by an arm in common use for self-defense can still be banned doesn't really fit with Heller, because Heller's entire thing, yes, Bruin is saying that you can if there is a historical tradition from the founding era that matches fairly closely with the modern gun regulation, it can be constitutional under the Second Amendment. That's what Bruin is saying. But Heller kind of already does the Bruin test just specifically for a total ban on arms that are in common use for self-defense, right? That's what the test is. And that's what they go through and say in Heller, that you can't ban an arm that's in common use for self-defense. In that case, it happened to be semi-automatic handguns, in the home, inside the home. But the basic test that they're doing is the one that would apply here. And this court, according to the dissenter, Judge Walker, went beyond, he sort of ignored the conclusion of Heller and went to another step beyond what made sense. Once you get to that conclusion that it's an arm in common use, his argument is that that's all you need to determine that you can't totally ban them. Now, you may be able to do other things, right? Other sorts of regulations on, for instance, who can own them, that sort of thing. But if they're not dangerous and unusual, if they're in common use for either self-defense or potentially for lawful purposes, you can't ban them totally. That's basically what he's saying. He's saying that's what Heller held. And I think that's probably the more fair read that the Supreme Court would put on it. But we won't know until the court itself takes up a case like this. It's just interesting to see I think the big takeaway here is to see a panel go this far down that path and then, make a veer off of it at the last moment to uphold the ban in this way. It's not something we've really seen before.
Yeah, it's a common outcome in these hardware ban cases, but a sort of a unique path to get there. But listeners should check it out and dig through the ruling, because it is interesting. The last story of ours that we want to talk about this week is actually one you covered, where we have some new comments from obviously presidential candidate Kamala Harris. She was on the Shannon Sharp podcast, where she loosely brought up gun policy, and she also did it in a way that sort of turned the tables on her challenger, Donald Trump. If you want to tell us about what she said.
Yeah, kind of a new avenue of attack that we haven't seen her use yet, where she brought up Donald Trump's 2022 comments on Truth Social, where he said that that essentially all of rules and regulations, including those in the Constitution, can be thrown out in the situation of his false claims about voter fraud in the previous election. This was, of course, 2 years after the election, but he's saying in this tweet or post on, or I don't know what they call truth. I think truths. I don't think that's what they call it. Anyway, in his statement, he said, you can terminate the rules of the Constitution in order to basically declare him president or declare a new election 2 years after the one that he lost. But and she's saying that implicates all of the rights in the Constitution, right? They're throwing out terminating the Constitution or terminating the rules of the Constitution. Implicates the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the third, fourth, fifth, obviously. And she does specifically talk about the Second Amendment, and she follows up with that she believes in the Second Amendment, and she doesn't want to take anyone's guns. So that's part of her messaging. That's something she's been saying, right? But it's new for her to incorporate these Trump comments about terminating the Constitution or terminating the rules in the Constitution or what have you into that. It's similar. It reminded me a bit of Tim Walz had recently also incorporated an attack on Trump's status as a felon, as a prohibited person. You can't own guns as of now because of his felony convictions. And so they hadn't done much of that either. And then Tim Walz did it. But they both, to be fair, I think they both seem like fleeting comments. I haven't heard either of them repeat those remarks. But it is interesting to see them brought up in this context because, they're relevant to the discussion, but they haven't really been used in that way. It's, obviously part of their attempt to court, I think, disaffected Republicans or moderates who are concerned about Trump's rhetoric. I guess, people like me, I guess, as we've talked about a little bit on the show before, my personal views on things, and just to be, I guess, give a more articulate more articulate than I'm immediately stumbling over myself. But, just a clearer explanation of some of the stuff because I've said, I think his comments scare me. This is the kind of comment that scares me, right? The terminating the Constitution, talking about being a dictator on day one, or at least for one day for some purposes, not when being directly asked if he'll be a dictator, not saying no, these sorts of things, talking the enemy within, sending the military after elected officials he doesn't like. That sort of stuff is what I mean when I say it scares me. And it's particularly concerning in light of the fact that after he lost the last election, he was willing to break the law to try and stay in office. So it's a little more in my view, than hollow, rhetoric or just a dumb thing he says or whatever. And so that's what I mean. This is the kind of stuff. And that's where my personal concerns come from, just to clarify what I mean when I've said this stuff in the past. Now, does that mean that I think, if we're getting into my personal views, you can look at that piece that we wrote and you can see that, Kamala Harris, while I feel like a man without a political party, I feel like a politically homeless person. I have for a while, right? It's not a new thing. I don't trust either of these parties. I think the Republican Party has moved away from me personally, and the Democrats haven't moved much towards me personally. I think I'm probably in the minority on that point, which is fine. But I'm sure I'm not alone either. And, if you look at Harris, she's certainly been more rhetorically pro-gun-ish or friendlier towards talking about owning guns and using them in self-defense and stuff like that, or, criticizing some of the stuff that Trump has said that might, make gun owners concerned. But obviously at the same time, policy-wise, she has not moved very far towards gun owners. She's moved slightly from her position of mandatory buybacks to just a position of assault weapons bans, sales bans. And she's running on the same platform that Joe Biden was. Nothing has really changed on that front. And you can look at her own record, which is what we do in the piece, and where she's been on the Second Amendment, because she's backed total bans on handguns. She's backed, as I just mentioned, the mandatory buybacks. She's also said she signed on to a brief opposing Heller, opposing basically the idea that DC's handgun ban violated the Second Amendment. At the same time, we've reported on some of her other comments where she suggested this Constitution does protect an individual's right to legally own guns, maybe in a more of a pragmatic calculation than an enthusiastic approval of that position, maybe. But, my point just is that I don't know that I trust Kamala Harris's change of reference on guns either, right? Like it's just that's where I come down on things. I think she would probably sign most gun control bills that made it to her desk. We're gonna have the Trace's Jennifer Massia on for the interview podcast this week, and we're gonna try and get from two different perspectives what we think are the likely potential legislative outcomes of legislative and executive authority outcomes for gun policy, depending on who wins. But yeah, I wouldn't necessarily trust her to do anything other than sign gun control bills that do make it to her desk, or continue up a very similar approach on the executive side to the Biden administration. I don't see why that would change. I'm personally, I am somebody I'm a gun owner. I'm a firearms instructor, NRA member, although I try not to hold an NRA membership most of the time since we cover them, but I do it to be able to have access to important information that informs our reporting. Right. And so, but I'm also somebody who is in favor of smaller government and traditionally conservative things, and who's disaffected by our current political moment. So just to give people a view of this, and I think that Trump's rhetoric and record scare me on things that are beyond and outside of gun policy. And I try my best to recognize my own views on these things and how they could influence our reporting, and to do my best to ensure that we're not just giving people one view of things. That's why we had Ed on last week. He has differs with me on this stuff significantly, and that's good. And I think our audience deserves to hear that point of view. And that's why in this piece on Harris, I make sure to go through and lay out where she has been I'm not trying to root for one side or the other on this stuff, trying to give people the relevant information. And I'd also talk as well about Donald Trump's, his own comments on backing that have upset gun rights advocates over the years, or things of that nature. He doesn't have 100% perfect record on gun policy either. It's certainly one I think most pro-gun voters would prefer Trump's record to Harris. That's probably an easy calculation to say, right? I don't think that's a very controversial point of view when you're just talking about gun policy. But obviously there's things beyond gun policy that impact all of our votes. So I don't know. I just wanted to try and explain this stuff. Like I'm a gunner. I like to build AR-15s and things like that. And that's that comes into play with our reporting here as well. It makes me more informed on the issue, but it also gives me a view on things too, and the one that I have to try and account for as well in my reporting. Not just to give the point of view of people who always agree with me. That's not what I try to do here on the Reload, right? I don't think people come here for that. And they probably don't come here to listen to this long of an explanation about it either, but I just wanted to get something coherent out there, and we can kind of move on to our headlines now. Cause I just wanted to be a little more coherent on exactly what I've been getting at with where I'm coming from on some of these things, because they've come up in previous podcasts.
Sure. Yeah. And, listeners can judge for themselves, obviously. Getting in some of the newsletter links, like you mentioned. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. We got a story in our newsletter links from Cam Edwards over at Bearing Arms, where he writes about, but he also quotes from an interesting report out of the Boston Globe dealing with something we talked about. I actually wrote a piece last week on this about, as we mentioned earlier, Jared Golden's vulnerability on the issue of guns and his flip-flopping on assault weapon bans. And this Boston Globe story that Cam quotes in his piece actually gets folks in that district on the record specifically referring to this change in position as a reason that they no longer support him. There's this one particular gentleman named Skip Works, who's actually a registered Democrat in that district and said he voted for Golden originally. And he says, I like the idea that he was an old-fashioned Democrat. But he said, I'm a sportsman and I love my guns. And basically saying that the change in stance is kind of turning him off of someone that he originally backed, and someone like Golden needs in that type of district to survive. It's, we've talked about before, it's a Trump plus 8 or so district, at least based on 2020's results. And to be a Democrat that survives in that kind of district, you need those types of voters. And, there's several others that are quoted talking about this one. Ben Dyer is another one that's quoted that specifically says he flip-flopped. He said, at one point I voted for him, but to see him flip-flop is not okay. So there's actual folks on the record that this line of attack is clearly working and could determine the outcome of the race.
Always good to hear directly from some voters on this to see how this kind of stuff is tracking with them, right? And it does seem from Cam's highlighting of this Boston Globe report that it is having an impact, at least on some people. So that's why it's a key race to watch for sure. Yeah.
And that's why the NRA is putting so much money into it. One other big story we want to talk about this week is this interesting sort of dust up with law enforcement that Detroit Lions wide receiver Jameson Williams recently had. So evidently there was a traffic stop that he was involved in with his brother, where his brother was actually the driver. And for, it happened, no charges or tickets were issued, apparently at the time, but then it came to light that during that traffic stop, 2 firearms were recovered in the vehicle, ostensibly belonging to each, Williams and his brother. His brother evidently is a concealed pistol license holder, while Jameson is not. And under Michigan law, to have a loaded firearm in a vehicle, you must be licensed. And so now that these details have come to light, there's some talk that the Detroit Police Department is actually going to charge him with a potential felony for doing so.
Yeah. I guess just to get this out of the way first, if you're a gun owner and you're going to carry your gun around on you, you have a responsibility to understand what your local laws are, right? And abide by them. So there's no excuse for that. At the same time, this is kind of exactly the sort of situation that permitless carry advocates are worried about, that they think is wrong. Because, this is a situation where somebody is carrying a gun, but there's no evidence he was intending to commit any crime with it, or necessarily that even understood that what he was doing was not legal in Michigan. Obviously he lives there now because he plays for the Lions. I don't think he's from Michigan originally. He may be from a state that doesn't have the same policy on this, because now most states don't have that policy, right? Even in states that still require a permit for carrying, like Virginia, for instance, you can carry a loaded gun in your car in a container, so concealed. You can open carry it, because Virginia is an open carry permitless without a permit state, but you can also carry it in like your glove box or your center console under an AG interpretation of the law, right? You don't need a permit for that technically. Now, I think if you're going to do that, you should probably just get the permit in Virginia. That's my personal advice to you as a firearms instructor with a concealed carry permit here. But and I think it's true as well in Colorado, right? Their rules don't require a permit to carry in a car necessarily, right?
Yeah, they consider a car an extension of your home, so it's totally permitless.
Even in states that require permits, this is not always a rule. So, it's just one of those things where this is sort of the story that that although, obviously applied to a rich, famous person, more problematic if he didn't have the resources he does to try and correct this legal situation, which I'm sure we'll probably be able to resolve pretty amicably. But, it's just one of those things where this is why permitless advocates don't like permits, because there's no evidence he did anything illegal beyond just having the gun. And it's true. The evidence would suggest he was not on his way to commit any crimes. His brother does have a license. They both legally own the guns that were found in the car. So, there's not really any evidence of any sort of criminal activity. In fact, the evidence points the other way, that these are just normal guys. And then, of course, there is a racial aspect to it as well, because you reported actually 2 years ago on the public defenders in Detroit, noting that 97% of people charged with carrying a firearm without a permit and no other crime similar to this situation are Black in a city that is 78% Black. So, there's a disparity in who gets charged with this stuff too. So that's another issue that often comes up in these sorts of cases. But, here's an NFL player that derives more attention when it happens to somebody like him than a normal person, but it still brings up these core issues at the center of this debate.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's like you said, it's every gun owner's responsibility to know and follow the law, but it also does highlight this broader principle and why this is such a hot button issue to begin with, because it can wrap anyone up, even including NFL players. So then the final story we want to touch on before we finish up here, it comes to us, some local Fox affiliate in Atlanta. Evidently, there was a 12-year-old that was his felony charges are being brought against him because he had a toy gun at school. Once again, talking about how these laws can wrap people up. I don't think most people would expect charging 12-year-olds with felonies for toys to be a natural result of gun laws, but here it is in practice. Yeah,
very concerning story. I mean, we don't have a lot of details. I think the report raises more questions than it answers. This is a local Fox affiliate out there in Atlanta. And did the student make some sort of threat and then bring a toy gun? What kind of toy gun was it? Was it something that would pass for a real gun and he was using it to threaten people? There's no details like that in the story. So unless that's the case, this seems like a pretty concerning overreaction. But I guess we'll have to wait and see if we get more details on this. Obviously, it's because it's a juvenile. We may not get every piece of information we would want to have to make a judgment on whether this is an appropriate response or not. But yeah, I mean, it is concerning to not have those sort of details, because if you're going to arrest and charge a 12-year-old with a felony over a toy, man, you better have a really good reason to do that, right? So I don't know, it's pretty a lot of questions out of this story.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And it's obviously, I think tensions are heightened now because of the recent mass shooting at a high school in Georgia. But, like you said, a toy is a toy, and we don't exactly have all the details. They don't allege, at least in this reporting that we have, that he actually made threats. So I don't know. It's just tough to see that when it comes to a 12-year-old getting a felony charge.
Yeah, for sure. Very concerning. Anyway, that's all we've got for this week. If you want to read some of the stories that we wrote that are member exclusives, you can head over and buy a membership today from thereload.com. That's how we do our reporting. We're a totally independent operation here. We are funded by our member dues. Is the only thing that keeps us going. So if you appreciate the work we do and you want to get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of news and analysis you won't find anywhere else, you should go over and pick up a membership today at thereload.com. And of course, if you're not ready to jump in and spend yet, you can just sign up for our free newsletter and get a feel for the kind of reporting we do, and see if we live up to the sort of things I was talking about earlier, trying to recognize our own biases or our own views and do our best to provide a good representation of what's true, regardless of where we personally fall on certain issues or candidates or whatever. Our goal is to inform you, not to yell our opinions into your face. Or yell your own opinions back at you. We try to do something a little different here at the Reload. And so I'd encourage you to check it out and see if you see if we're living up to that standard we set for ourselves. But that's all we've got. And I think I'm going to send it over to myself for a little message from the Dispatch. This week, we're doing another ad swap with the Dispatch. We have a free 30-day trial over at the Dispatch for any Reload reader who wants to give them a try. And I think it makes a lot of sense because we tend to focus on the same things. Of course, the Dispatch has, in addition to reporting, a lot of opinion and analysis from big name folks you probably heard of, Steve Hayes, Jonah Goldberg, Alla Pundit. And there's a lot of guys over there that have been major players in the center-right conservative media space for a long time, and who I enjoy reading quite a bit. But in addition to their opinion and editorial work, they have a distinct focus on facts-first reporting, on hard news in the same way that we do here at the Reload. And I think that if you like the reporting we do, if you like our approach, you will probably enjoy the Dispatch and their approach. And they're an even bigger publication than we are, with more resources, with a wider view, of course, of politics. They go into a lot more areas than we do. And so I think they're just a really good resource, and you should check them out. Sign up for that 30-day free trial. Give it a try. Been a paying member since they were founded, and I highly recommend them. So head over to the Dispatch today to check out what they have to offer. We have a link, of course, in the description and on our website to the 30-day free trial. So give it a try. See what you like.